Welcome to the Mockingcast, the podcast of Mockingbird Ministries. I'm David Zoll, your host, and in a few moments, I'll be joined by my co-hosts, Sarah Condon and RJ Heyman. We come to you every other week to discuss a few of the places where we currently see grace and its absence playing out in unexpected and compelling ways. We're glad to have you with us.
Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. God.
Happy New Year. I know I've watched enough Curb Your Enthusiasm to know that we're well past the sell-by date on wishing that, but we haven't recorded since 2025 began, and I haven't certainly I've talked to you, but I haven't seen your faces. So Happy New Year, you guys. How was the break? How was the holiday? What do we have to report?
You know, it was a tough one. And not for any reason other than grief and extended family being a little wild, and but we got through it. It sucks. Yeah, it's hard because I, grew up with a mom who cried every Christmas, and I just found it really infuriating. And now, guess what?
You or she.
Yeah.
Did Josh or the kids come through with any cool presents?
Oh, I mean, come on now.
Josh always comes through. Let's be honest.
Josh
come on.
killed it. Josh killed it. Yeah. So no, I mean, it's
Uber
like our
husband.
nuclear family. Our nuclear family. Everything was like really beautiful, and of course, everything at church was really beautiful. I have to say, like, I felt like, I know this is so weird, but like my crucial turning point into feeling better was Epiphany, because Epiphany is such a big deal at St. B's. And it was like, there was something so connective and beautiful and hopeful. Like, I never really think about Epiphany, and suddenly we're at this church that's like, I don't know. It really helped. I don't know why, but it did. So
how many Christmas trees did you burn this year?
So that's funny. This year it was this crazy storm, and really ice cold, and so we couldn't do it. And so it was just hundreds of us all gathered in a gym together. There's a chili cook-off competition. We ordered barbecue. Our music director, who can really turn any environment into an English pub, has us all singing these carols together. I mean, it was just like the best.
So fun.
Yeah, it was really, really,
while
really
the world
good.
just starts to love and get obsessed with Advent, maybe it's time for some more Epiphany love.
I know.
Maybe that's what we can.
It's the next stage.
Into it.
We had a great Christmas. Of course, the big boys were home, which is just always so lovely. The house is just so full of life and loud. And then the Addams family came also for about 5 days down to South Florida. So that was really fun, and spent a good amount of time on the beach, played a little golf, which I'm terrible at, for the record. But it was just really fun to be with them. And then they left, and my wife was really depressed for a couple of days, because it's really hard when you got the full house and you got the big boys home. And then suddenly, not that we don't love Marshall. Marshall's great, but Marshall was sad too. He's like, why can't Jackson work here? Why can't Spencer go to school here? And I'm like, oh, buddy. So we had to be calling brothers and checking in. But it was really fun. I happened to mention in a sermon a few weeks before Christmas that what Marshall really wanted was a bearded dragon for Christmas, and I wasn't sure he was going to get that. And then a family from church called me. They said, we have 2 geckos that we really want to get rid of. Do you want them? I was like, yes, please. So with all the stuff. So Marshall got a leopard gecko and a crested gecko for Christmas. And he he named them Giga and Chad, which will mean something to someone out there.
God.
You know the whole Chad thing? Are your boys into that? Anyway, which is because he watches too much YouTube. But they're amazing. So we had a fun Christmas.
Do you know the children's book, The Christmas Lizard?
No.
Okay, it's out of print. I'm going to send you a copy. It's so beautiful. It's
The
about a
Christmas
lizard that
I need that.
He it's super Christian in this really interesting way. Climbs
there's something
up.
that you like that's super Christian?
I know. It's the one thing,
Sarah.
the Christmas lizard. And it may be written by a Mormon. I mean, scandalous.
Well, okay. That just now makes
the lizard
sense. Good.
the lizard like climbs the Christmas tree and learns about the Christmas story through all these different ornaments. And then at the end, an angel like flies him across to the manger on the mantle. It is the coolest book ever.
Ooh,
Well,
wow.
Sarah, I think there's an opening in the market for the Epiphany lizard.
That's right.
If and when you're ready, when the spirit leads.
And Dave, how was your Christmas?
Well, my Christmas was both wonderful, and we went to DC to be with my in-laws for a week, and it was really nice and full house and all that things. But then we came back and we had that sort of glorious space between week. But then it snowed in Virginia about 6 inches, and they closed schools for the entire first week. That the kids were supposed to go back. So if anyone is a parent to children or remembers those days, that is a kick in the shins of a large magnitude. And so it was just like Kate and I very much feel like we've just started. Like the kids had a first full day of school on Tuesday, which is yesterday. So, if we'd known it was going to be another 2 weeks after Christmas that we'd have off, we probably would have gone somewhere. But the big news for me is that, through the Christmas of this year, I completed my Garbage Pail Kids collection. I now have a full series 1 of Garbage Pail Kids from 1985. The sense of completion is profound, although fleeting, and I'm already thinking about the next thing. But those who've been tracking with me on this, it's been a solid 5 years of every couple of weeks buying one card. The last one, if those who are interested, was Mean Gene, who's a little baby with a huge bazooka. So that was quite a thrill. A thrill of hope, you guys. Well, let me ask you this before we jump in: are there any? Are you in the business of making any resolutions? Is there any kind of thoughts on the advent of the new year? Are you? We're going to talk a little bit here today about New Year, New You, or as Sarah once wrote, New Year, Old You. But I don't know. It's always still fun to check in to see if there's anything specific that you have that you're looking forward to, or excited about, or hopeful about in this new year. Anything?
I want to see more friends this year. I really want to see Ginger Oaks. I know she's a listener. Like, I just want to spend time with friends in a pretty big way. That's kind of my goal for the year.
That's a great one.
Yeah.
That's part of what we're going to talk about today. RJ, anything for you? Survive?
That's honestly, I was going to say, I feel like I'm just hanging on for dear life. We're coming into our busiest time of year, which is always really fun. Like there's tons of people around, but we're fully in season here in South Florida from now until about Easter or early May, and things are just crazy. I mean, it's really fun, but it's crazy and exhausting. But yeah, so no, I mean, yeah. If I ever get to the point where I can actually start making resolutions, you'll know that I'm in a totally different headspace and have reached the next level of maturity or submission. I don't know.
Well, for me, this is the year of this book that's coming out, The Big Relief. It's out April 29th. People,
so exciting.
Would love for people to pre-order it. I've finally finished, yet another round of notes, and I've gotten to the point where I feel like it is the best possible book I could write at this point in my life. So
it is the most anticipated book of the year according to Christianity Today. Top of the list of most anticipated books.
Is it really?
Very kind. I don't know if that's even remotely true. That's what's happening for me. I'm about to shift gear into major promo mode for that. But also, I'm thinking about the Mockingbird conference that we do. It's May 1st through 3rd, that's sort of in conjunction with the release of this book. And I just have to say, it's been funny to watch over the years because it's happening now consistently. That I have to toot our own horn. Like you have someone, invite them to speak at Mockingbird and no one knows who they are. And then 5 years later, everyone is like, hey, have you heard of Jonathan Haidt? Yeah, he spoke for us, in 2012. Or have you heard about Tom Holland? Yes. He was one of our conference speakers, or Oliver Berkman or Kobe Campbell. And I feel very much like Elizabeth Oldfield, who's speaking, is going to be one of those people. She was just mentioned on Ezra Klein's podcast this past week. She's written a wonderful book called Fully Alive, but Harrison Scott Key is coming, and we had him before his huge book.
I didn't realize Harrison.
He wrote the
was
National
coming.
Harris is
That's awesome.
coming. Yeah, he wrote the national anthem. So
did,
the early bird is almost expired. It'll be up for a couple more days after this comes out. But I just want to encourage people to get on the front end. You know, you'll all your friends will think you're so cool when you were there first. So let's talk. Let's move into the articles this week. The first thing is something my sister-in-law Bonnie sent me. It is a newsletter from Vox, a newsletter actually about meditation, written by Oshan Yarrow. And this is what he writes. He says, "I've been meditating with varying degrees of commitment for about a decade. And the new year, a time when the ranks of meditating Americans swell with New Year's resolutionists, or as I keep hearing, resolutionaries, at least for a few weeks, gives me a great excuse to tell one of my favorite meditation stories. Ram Dass was a 20th century American spiritual teacher and former Harvard psychologist who played a big role in kindling Western interest in meditation. At an event once, someone asked him for advice. They said they knew they ought to meditate more, but struggled with committing to a regular practice. Forget it, he responded. Go out and lust some more. Go until you are so nauseated by your own predicament that you yearn to meditate. Get so hungry for it that you can't wait to just sit down, turn off the television, turn off the drama, and just be quiet for a few minutes. Wait until you really want it, because when you start with I should, you end up hating the practice." Yarrow continues. He says, in recent decades, a narrow band of basic meditation practices exploded into the mainstream. He's talking mainly about mindfulness. But the overwhelmingly popular narrative about meditation centers on stress relief, a framing that has helped make meditation feel like yet another thing we ought to do. That, in turn, dooms it to wind up in the resolution graveyard alongside exercise, diets, and my short-lived resolve to become a jazz pianist. Now, I loved this for obvious reasons. I not because I'm a big meditation guy, though I've got nothing against it. The idea that all you need to change your behavior is just a resolution and a little commitment is just so. It's something that's very tempting, and I think it's something that's kind of hopeful. And I don't want to poo-poo it too much. And yet what I love how Ram Dass says, go and lust some more. Basically, go get so hungry that you need this.
Sin boldly.
That it doesn't become a I should, but becomes I want.
It's all I can think about is sin boldly. I just
it's a sin boldly. It's a sin boldly. So I mean, what is tell us, RJ, what does that mean when you hear sin boldly? Because that's a who said it and what is actually
Martin
going
Luther
on
said
there?
it right. Was it to Melanchthon, something like that? You know, because Melanchthon, of course, I think, was like a lot of earnest young Christians, just very concerned with their piety, what they should be doing, their sin, like trying to get under control. And Luther said something like, look, you're a sinner. We live in the world. So be a sinner and sin boldly, but trust in Christ even more boldly. Because, if the sin is real, the mercy must be real. And Jesus doesn't save imaginary sinners. He saves real sinners, and that part of, I think the brand of Christianity that we espouse, which I think is what I would hopefully is, biblical, legitimate Christianity, has to do, your father would talk about integrating the negativity, that so much of the time Christians, if you think you should be something or have to be something, you're trying to be something for God. You end up splitting into two different people. One person who's kind of your church persona, who's fulfilling all those supposed, those laws, and then your real self who goes home and does all sorts of stuff that you're very ashamed of. And the harder the louder the voice of the should, the louder the more rampant the sinful nature runs. It's like the Tiger Woods phenomenon. Right? Like he's working so hard to have a perfect life, be the perfect golfer, be the perfect example, have the perfect marriage. And actually he's just like having sex with porn stars on the side, because So what Christianity does, hopefully, is it forgives the sinner. It forgives the sin. It says there should is out the window. And it sort of allows you to become an integrated whole human being, who says, yes, I'm broken. I'm a sinner. I am not what I ought to be. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and I'm loved as I am. So I don't know. I just said a lot.
Yeah, no, that's a lot.
But that was Luther's advice. Is like the yeah, you're going to sin. But guess what? Jesus saves sinners, and not imaginary sinners, but actual sinners, real sinners performing real sins. And you're not, and by the way, you're not fooling anybody. Certainly not God.
And the way that translates into any kind of change is when you actually are stricken to the core of, like,
Yeah.
where you need forgiveness, where you need God, where you're not just like saying, this is something I ought to need, or I know I should turn to God. It's like when you actually, he's saying, get so hungry that you can't wait to sit down. And I feel that's the same way around prayer and one's relationship with God. He's after an authentic encounter or an authentic, transformation. I think that the same principles apply. But Sarah, where does your mind go?
It makes me think about addiction and how we sort of have this requirement, and it allows those of us who think of ourselves as not addicted to things to say, like, oh, well, they hit rock bottom. Like, that's why they're so desperate. Like, you have to hit rock bottom. And it's like, I think most of us are probably hitting rock bottom, like, a lot of the time, and aren't acknowledging it. And we just keep sitting at the bottom. And I think there's something humbling about this idea that all of our lives are probably loud enough that we should be driven to our knees in meditation or prayer or otherwise. So yeah, it kind of makes me think about how you don't hear this talk a lot, like, especially in sort of Eastern religion, where it's like, I should say Eastern religion Americanized, right? Where it's like, actually things have to be really shitty for you to find something hopeful. And I think actually that's just the Christian message, probably. Things have to be really shitty for you to find something hopeful.
The way that I've the common, there's sort of a helpful formulation that I've heard is that people the only two change agents in life are desperation and love. And to be given what addicts call the gift of desperation is a wonderful thing that's very painful, but it is where you turn to the outside, to a power greater than yourself, to something. I mean, the other way people change is when they no longer feel they have to in order to be loved, because to want to be a changed person or to adopt healthier habits, I don't think that we should. Nothing. That's wonderful. Like, but the question is, when it becomes a should.
How does it
game
happen?
Of tennis. Well, yeah, how does it actually happen? And I think desperation and love are the two change agents. And certainly Ram Dass is saying, he's talking about desperation here. I think love is the other one, though. I mean,
well, and I think about, like, the will, right? I think this speaks to the lack of will that we all have. And I don't know. Now that we're like full-fledged middle-aged adults, and we have friends that run. I'm sure you have these like obnoxious, horrible people in your life that run like 5 miles a day or something insane to me outside.
Strava,
which is obscene.
Yeah,
and. Like, but now, I used to look at them and be like, God, they've got so much discipline, and how do they do it, and blah, 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 blah. And it's like, well, probably because they were fat in 5th grade. I don't know. Like, do you know what I mean?
No,
like,
it's like
our
anxiety.
lives create.
It's to deal with anxiety. It's a survival mechanism.
Or that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, it's like, it's none of this is will-based, right? None of our New Year's resolutions are will-based. It's just a question of like, how desperate are we for something different?
Oh, and the flip side of that, I mean, I do think, sin is, we're not going to stop sinning, but some sins are fun in the beginning, but at the end of the day, sin ends up not being fun. We end up hurting ourselves, hurting people around us. And what I find is I do think a lot of sin is driven by fear. Fear of that I'm alone. It's all up to me. By shame, I'm failing. I need to do something to stop feeling the way that I'm feeling right now. And to the degree that we connect with a God who loves us and is present and is doing something, even when it kind of hurts or we're scared, and that we can sort of rest and actually abide, to use that biblical word, abide in his love, the compulsion to sin, I think, that gets tamped down a little bit. It's like I don't need to escape. I don't need to find an escape, or I don't need to do something to sort of take care of to provide for myself. And I don't need to lie. I don't need to cheat. I don't need to steal, because God will take care of me. Now, unfortunately, those moments of resting in God's love are sort of few and far between, and often come on the tail end of some sort of disaster. Where for like a few days or a few weeks, you're like, oh, it is going to be okay. I'm going to be okay. And then, life intrudes, or your own psychology intrudes. But anyway, motivation matters, and emotion, all
Motivation
these things.
matters
Yeah, these
hugely.
things
I think
matter.
motivation, the heart. It's what's going on inside. It's what. Are you doing the right thing for the wrong reasons, or the wrong thing for the right reasons? These are questions that are not secondary. So,
No.
but let's talk about something that I think that Sarah talked about. One of her resolutions being to spend more time with friends. And this is a wonderful article, appeared in the Atlantic Monthly by Ellen Cushing. This was sent to me by Lizzie, I work with, who's a wonderful youth worker here at Christ Church. Americans need to party more. She writes this: America is in a party deficit. Only 4% of Americans attended or hosted a social event on an average weekend in 2023. This is a 35% decrease since 2004. Last month, Party City, the country's largest retailer of balloons and goofy dispensable plates, announced that it would close after years of flagging sales and looming debt. Adolescents are engaging in markedly fewer risky behaviors than they used to. Jude Bell, a psychologist who has extensively researched this phenomenon, told me 6 months ago on Reddit, someone asked one of the saddest questions I've ever seen on the social platform, which is really saying something. This is the question: did anyone else think there would be more parties? The post continues: when I was a kid, my parents and extended family used to have serious parties on a regular basis. I remember houses and yards full of people, music all the way up, lots of food, and of course, free-flowing alcohol. Neighbors, family, coworkers, their friends, they all showed up. And likewise, my parents went to their parties. I thought this is what my adult years would be like, but they aren't. Cushing goes on to say, polling in 2023 showed that although 84% of Americans enjoy birthday parties, only 59% had attended one in the previous year. And in a different poll, only 28% of respondents said that they would probably or definitely throw a party for their next birthday, which means everyone wants to attend parties, but no one wants to throw them. We just expect them to appear when we need them, like fire trucks. Intimacy, togetherness, the opposite of the crushing loneliness so many people seem to feel, are what parties alchemize. Warm rooms on cold nights, so many people you love thumbtacked down in the same place. These are things anyone can have, but like everything worth having, they require effort. Fire trucks, after all, don't come from nowhere. They come because we pay taxes. So this year, pay your taxes. Resolve to throw 2 parties. 2 because 2 feels manageable. And chain letter math dictates that if every party has at least 10 guests, and anything less is not a party, and everyone observes host-guest reciprocity, then everyone gets 20 party invitations this year, possibly many more. What a thing. By the way, this article starts out by saying, someone there, she quotes a fellow writer of hers who said, it's not like you could just go someplace on Sunday and just check in with 300 of your closest friends. And she mentions that religious institutions are on the decline, but the whole time we're thinking yes, you can. There is a place. It may not always feel that way in your context. However, that is what's going on for many people on Sunday mornings. However,
that's what coffee hour is. Definitely what our coffee hour is. It's a weekly party. Yeah.
Does this resonate? Does this strike a chord?
I mean, I think that's an obvious place for us all to go. I don't know that that's helpful. I don't know. I mean, I totally get it, but I wonder in our day-to-day social lives, having people over and going over to people's houses, that is a lost art. I mean, I was telling Josh the other day that I remember my parents, people would knock on the door and my parents would open it up and then they'd come sit in our living room entirely unannounced for 2 hours. My mom would make bread, it would be a whole thing.
Yeah.
And now, when the doorbell rings, we're like, oh my God, don't answer that. It's just it's so radically different. And I wonder honestly about, and this is going to be such a specific thing, but it is a thing I think about a lot, how social media for women has become so legalistic in terms of like everything being from scratch and everything looking a certain way and everything feeling a certain way and how impossible that makes it. We had 2 couples over for dinner the other night, and we're trying to do more of this because we need it and we know people in our lives need it. And so we had 2 couples over for dinner the other night. And one of the ladies later was like, wow, you have really gotten Tex-Mex down. Like, send me your recipes. And I was like, I got you. And it was like pre-packaged, cook in the microwave, cilantro lime rice, pre-packaged, cook in the microwave, seasoned pinto beans. Target is slaps right now. Okay. And then I was like, the key is you got to put them in one of your pans and put them in the oven to warm, and then throw away all the bags. And
that's the prep. That's
the prep. That's how you get it done. And
Trader Joe's. Yes.
Yeah. And I think the bar feels really high. And I will say, from the standpoint of church, because we've always hosted a lot of stuff, it has enabled me to really kind of let go of this, like, everything has to be perfect. And like, you don't want everyone to feel anxious and rushed. And I think letting go of perfection for the sake of just getting together is such a beautiful thing.
But it seems like part of the entertaining is making Instagrammable
totally
decorations.
Totally.
Yeah, blame Martha
and
Stewart.
all the food. I mean,
yeah, didn't we just talk about her?
I do think that's part of it. Like, I mean,
I think
it just
it's
feels like,
100%.
I mean, I remember a friend saying to me a couple of years ago, she made tacos and she felt bad because she did make the tortillas from scratch. And I was like, are you high? Like, why would you do that? Like, are you Mexican? No. Okay. Are you a white girl in Mississippi? Yes. Like, don't make tortillas from scratch.
RJ, what does this make you think?
Well, my son, Marshall, literally said to my wife yesterday, said to Jamie, why is our house so messy, but all my friends' houses are so clean? And Jamie was like, because they clean up when you come over
there.
Yeah, they clean up like we do.
Yeah.
And that is 100%. It's like, how can we have people over? And I will say, actually, we're in a community that has a lot of parties. We go to a lot of parties. We probably don't host as many as we should because it just feels so. Well, first of all, we're not going to throw a party on a Saturday night because I'm up, like, at the crack of dawn on Sunday morning. So there's really only Friday.
No, we don't go to parties on Saturday night.
No, and if I go, I'm out of here by 9. Like at the latest. But the demand for perfection feels very high, and you want everything to be just right. I will say we finally threw a party, like, for our vestry at our house in December, and it was basically kind of a potluck, and I felt kind of guilty about it because I'm like, we should do everything ourselves, but we just couldn't. We were too busy, and everyone had the best time. They were like, that was so great. We should do this more often. And then also recently, this was really liberating. Went to a party at a friend's house, kind of a birthday party for Marshall, for one of his friends, but the parents were invited as well. And the father is like a serious French chef. He owns like 3 or 4 restaurants, in the area. Everything was packaged food from BJ's. And he did not even try to hide the fact that, like, he took the pigs in the blanket out of the cardboard box and put them into the oven. And he brought out, like, the brownies in, like, on the plastic tray. And he's like, I love BJ's. And everyone's just sitting there being like, this is awesome. Like, we're at a French chef's restaurant, and it just brought the expectation way down. It was like, oh, I guess I could throw a party where everything was from Costco or Target, and he didn't even try to hide it. Like, it was very liberating. So, and we had a great time. It's like, who cares? But it's totally the Martha Stewart. Everything must be perfect.
Well, I think this is something that I talk about a lot with my wife, because we too also live in a town that is fairly what we call social, and there are lots of parties and things like that. And it was almost too much during the holiday season. And yet still this refrain of, when are we going to entertain again? When are we going to have people over? And how come they never seem to reciprocate in the way that they used to? Maybe it was before we had children, but it was a drumbeat. And I think that part of the thing of working for a church is that you not only do that on Sundays, but you're almost like, there's a little bit of this social, fellowship is what it's called, is kind of part of what you do. But even outside of that, I think that the fun deficit, as we've talked about before, is like really low. I think people are wiped out. And I think that you're 100% right. The bar for having people over is just really, really high. The other night, like the idea of having a party that we put invitations for and invite, 30 people over to, we still haven't done it at our new house after we moved. And it's like this sort of hanging thing over us. But the other night, we had a cousin coming into town, and just that afternoon called up 2 other families and said, "Hey, why don't you come over?" And we had the nicest time. No photos were taken. We ordered some pizza. And they put on a fire, and the kids just absolutely loved it. But I remember very distinctly, like my parents not only having folks over, but constantly going out to parties. And if there is a resolution, let it be one to have some fun for fun's sake.
Engage in more risky behaviors.
Engage in a little bit more risky behavior for the sake of the gospel, or for the sake of your own soul or psychology, or however you want to put it. Because we've never done it and regretted it. I mean, because even when it's a disaster, there's stories to tell. You get to have those debriefing sessions where you just completely, dress everybody down, and it's fun. I find it to be a really great thing. I often, though, there's a sense in her piece that people know this is a good thing and they want it, but they just can't seem to summon the wherewithal to do it. And that is basically the human condition. And right now, this is where it's taking place. People are that exhausted. There's that much going on. There's that many kids' activities.
Yeah.
So I have compassion for the non-party throwers and non-party goers out there, but I also know sometimes if the medicine for what ails us is to just go and enjoy ourselves a little bit more, what a wonderful thing that is. That's a solvable issue.
It is a solvable issue. Yeah.
It's RJ. You talked earlier about fear when it came to being a change agent in people's lives. There's a book that's been making the rounds. This is Elizabeth Colbert wrote in The New Yorker, a profile of a new book by a moral psychologist named Kurt Gray. This is an article, Does One Emotion Rule All Our Ethical Judgments? This was in The New Yorker last week. She begins by talking about Raymond Dart, who was in the 1920s. He found the missing link between man and ape, and concluded that man's predecessors differed from living apes in being confirmed killers. Our ancestors were carnivorous creatures that seized living quarries by violence, battered them to death, tore apart their broken bodies, dismembered them limb from limb, slaking their ravenous thirst with the hot blood of victims.
This took a turn.
Whoa. That narrative of
what
that
was
we were
his childhood like?
Well, the narrative that we are predators by nature.
Okay.
According to this article in this book, it was the dominant narrative for the entire 20th century. And so when we're getting back to nature and kind of that's us getting back to like, clubs, there's garbage pail kids, right? Of cavemen with clubs that just want to kill everything in sight. But scientists have come to believe that his theory was completely wrong. The fossils that he's basing this theory on, the Tuang child in Africa, now believe that those bones of this sort of intermediary species was actually killed by a bird of prey, as were all the animals it was found with. It turns out instead of being dauntless predators, our ancestors, it seems, were more likely prey. They spent much of their time and their increasing brain power trying not to become dinner. All right, so in this new book, and I promise this is going somewhere, this new book is called Outrage, Why We Fight About Morality and Politics and How to Find Common Ground. Moral psychologist Kurt Gray argues that the most pressing problems of contemporary society can be traced back to this one faulty conclusion. Our ethical judgments, he suggests, are governed not by a complex of modules, but by one overriding emotion. Untold generations of cowering have written fear into our genes, rendering us hypersensitive to threats of harm. Gray writes, if you want to know what someone sees as wrong, your best bet is to figure out what they see as harmful. At another point, he writes, all people share a harm-based moral mind. At still another point, he says, harm is the master key of morality. Well, if people have all the same ethical equipment, why are ethical questions so divisive? Gray's answer is that different people fear differently. As long as there's a perception of harm, there's a potential for outrage because fear and moral indignation are inextricably linked. Indeed, Gray argues, the safer we've become from physical danger, the more hazards we see lurking out there. Millions of years of being hunted have made us preoccupied with danger, he writes. But without saber-toothed cats to fear, we fret about elections, arguments in group texts, and decisions at PTA meetings. Respect is easiest to build with harm-based storytelling. Now, what he's trying to do, by the way, just for those who are interested in the fine print here, he's trying to do away with moral foundations theory, which is something Jonathan Haidt has pioneered, which I think is very fascinating, but saying that essentially all of our moral decisions boil down to fear and what we're afraid of. What do we think can cause us harm? Who do we think are under threat, and who do we think are the threateners? And the extent to how you perceive that will be how your morality develops. I know this is conceptual, but it's really interesting to me in terms of he wants to sort of try to find common ground. If you want to sympathize with someone who you disagree with about everything, you have to find out, what are they afraid of? And then you may not agree with them, but you might find some entry point. But again, I take real issue with this because I think that fear is not a Christian view of morality is one that is not fear-based, it's love-based.
Perfect love drives out all fear. Yeah.
Yeah. RJ, go, talk.
No. I
Anything
agree
else
with this.
you got to say? Or is that it?
I think that's it. That's all I got to say. I agree with this. I think most people, most of the time, are walking around scared of something, right? Scared that they're going to be humiliated, scared that they're going to get sick, scared that no one's ever going to love them, scared they're going to run out of money. Yes, absolutely. I think it's why we drive gigantic cars. It's why when people get wealthy, they move on to properties with big hedges surrounding them. Yeah, I completely agree. And even, listening to, I love the Rest is History podcast with our good friend Tom Holland, and they're doing a whole series on like the rise of Hitler right now. And what you find out, Hitler was very much like Vladimir Putin. If you want to unite a people, convince them that there's someone out to get them, create fear, and you will unite them in opposition to whatever that fear is, real or imagined. So I think it is true. And like you said, I do think Christianity has an answer to it, which is if God be for us, who can be against us? And if God gave his own son for us and he's on our side, then we have nothing to fear. We're playing with house money. We know the end of the story. Even the bad things that happen, God turns to good. And it just kind of lowers the temperature on all that and actually enables you to have a loving relationship with another human being. Even if you don't see eye to eye on everything. So I don't know. I agree. And I'll say, I've had therapists who said this before too, that so much of our anxiety is driven by the fight or flight response, which was conditioned in us over millions of years of evolution. And we don't have those kind of, we're not being stalked by lions anymore, but we still have all those emotions and they have to go somewhere. And so they go into our politics, that's mainly where they go. If they don't go, and that's why exercise is kind of a good thing, because it I think does. And I say that as somebody who doesn't exercise nearly enough, but it allows you to sort of get out some of that energy. So it's not just running rampant in your brain. Sarah.
Yeah, I do want to say I totally agree. And I was thinking, because RJ, you'd mentioned the exercise thing. Maybe our last podcast or something, that like you have this energy, it has to go somewhere. And so that's helpful. And I will say, I don't run 5 miles every day, but like probably twice a week I go to the YMCA and I run for like 2 miles. And it is incredibly helpful when it comes to this like anxiety that kind of can rattle around in our bodies. And I totally agree. That the idea that fear is the only thing guiding us, I do think is true. I think in the Christian life, especially when sort of suffering meets the Christian life, that all of that can be altered. The other thing I want to talk about is grandmothers. there's been a lot of really interesting research around why we have grandmothers, because when we think about sort of early human beings, it's like, what purpose did these women serve, right? They weren't out hunting, they weren't, bearing children, they weren't. And there's all this research that tells us that like really society became possible because there were these older women who were not going to have children anymore and who could care for the community, who could share the wisdom passed down, and who could probably abate some fear. So anyway, it just made me think of that because it's something I've been thinking about a lot lately.
Wow. I mean, I think I consider like I've had a series of therapists who are basically all grandmothers, and
It's
I think
100%.
I trust them more than than my own gender in that respect, and there seems to be repositories of wisdom. I know that that's not everyone's experience of a grandmother, but it's certainly been mine. I mean, I feel like fear dominates my internal psychology. It dominates everything. It's one of the reasons why I'm a Christian. It's one of the reasons why I find tremendous consolation and comfort. And I have to, one of the things you sort of learn, I think, in the spiritual life, any kind of journey, is to like, how much is fear driving this decision and how much is faith driving it? Or like at least or even look back and just be like, oh my gosh, God redeemed even my fearful decisions. And that was completely, fear was driving the train. And when am I at my best? It's when somehow, by the grace of God, the fear abates, and that fight or flight response, or the amygdala response, or whatever you want to call it, the high cortisol response, that can abate, and there's a little bit of clarity. I think can be a really beautiful, beautiful thing. The only thing I'd say is that there is sometimes in these evolutionary moral psychologists, there's such a drive to boil everything down into one or two things. I love the attempt to get behind how people are, because so much of the dialogue, so much of the discourse is always on the about facts and reasons and all these things, and they are right in that most of our decision making is according to intuitions and emotions, and fear being probably the strongest of them. But love is another extremely strong one. But I think about our friends, the people I know in LA. Now we're dealing with it. We've been watching from the East Coast all of these terrible fires, and they weren't afraid enough of that. They were like, at least it puts everything else in perspective clearly, but it's like I remember reading that a lot of what the reasons that the wildfire spread is because people were told there was a law that you're not allowed to erect all this shrubbery in front of your yard, in your yard, because it would burn. But people all disregarded it because they wanted their privacy, and they're probably a little feeling protected. And as a result, it spread a lot faster. Now, that's not to cast blame. There's a lot of reasons why this happened, but it's super interesting. And I relate to it on the level of sort of snow-related school closures, because everything, I'm told to stay safe constantly. Stay safe, stay safe, stay safe. And if I hear that word one more time, I want to say, like, what if safety is not the actual end-all be-all of existence? What if love is? Like, what if there's something that's more important than me staying safe? Of course I want to be safe, naturally. But I always feel like it's what you're really saying is stay afraid.
Yes.
And I don't want to stay afraid. I like especially,
and like stay isolated. Like I sort of refuse to watch this. I'm gesturing towards my television. I refuse to watch the documentary film about the guy who's trying to live forever. Have you
Everyone
guys seen
tells
this?
us we have to watch it.
I can't watch it because, and this is why, I saw an article the other day that when his wife or partner or whoever, they'd been together a long time, they lived together, was diagnosed with cancer, he was like, not in my house. And I think about like how isolating it is, like the ultimate safety, the ultimate I'm going to live forever, right? It's that quote. I can never remember who said it. And it was in the opening of a book, but it was like, when all the yards are mowed and all the children are respectful and all the houses are clean and all the husbands are happy at work, then you'll know the devil's in charge. It's just like
Wow.
when everything is too put together, that's
When no one's going to
all
parties.
relationality, no one's going to parties, right?
Everything's
When your
in
house
control.
is so clean. Yeah. That's when the darkness is in charge.
Oh my gosh, what a quote. I've never heard that, Sarah. We got to find that source.
I know it's at the beginning of it. It's like a quote that opens a book, and it's and I'd always I can't remember the book, but the quote stays with me.
Well, as a total counterpoint to this, at our church, I lead the adult education, and we've been doing a series of Saints of Grace, we're calling it, and just sort of lives of incredible figures. And we're talking about Julian of Norwich, and we're not doing Fred Rogers or Dolly Parton because we have to
Weird
cover
Al.
some of the basics first. We're Flannery O'Connor, and then we're also doing. I started it out by talking about Francis of Assisi, and I don't know much about Francis of Assisi, so I had to read this whole Chesterton book this past week and got really sort of into the whole thing. We're going to do Bill Wilson in a couple weeks. So we're doing interesting people. And the day before I had to teach, this article appeared in the Atlantic Monthly by James Parker called "The Saint America Needs Right Now." It's an amazing review of a new book about Francis of Assisi. So Francis of Assisi, if you don't know, lived in I think born 1181, died 1228, just off the top of my head, 1226. And James Parker says this, he says, was he a genius or a crackpot? Both.
Yes.
Was Francis a sensuous embracer of life or a self-mortifying freak? Both. Exhibitionist or recluse, anarchist or company man, runaway rich kid or true voice of the rejected, both, and both. And when God spoke to him in 1206, his voice issuing from a crucifix saying, Francis, do you not see that my house is falling into ruin? Go therefore and repair the house. Did God mean the dilapidated, bat-flitted holes in the roof church in which Francis at that moment happened to be kneeling? Or did he mean the whole of medieval Christendom? He meant, of course, both. And he talks a little bit about Francis's own story. If people know about it, you know that Francis had a major humiliation where he stole from his father and tried to repair that church using stolen funds from his dad. And his father brought him before all the courts and then the bishops. And he takes off his fancy. His father was a silk merchant, so he takes off his clothes, and there's these paintings of it, and he says, from this moment on, I'm only God's. And he sort of renounces his earthly father, and he walks into the woods in just a hair shirt singing a psalm. And he's always associated with nature. Anyway, Barker writes, Francis tears off his fancy clothes, he kisses lepers, he starts begging. It's all a bit unbalanced. He turns his back on privilege and plunges madly downward. Parker says, perhaps this is the point of the story at which Francis, were he trying something similar today here in America, would find himself scooped up by psychiatry and institutionalized.
100%, yeah.
Or at the very least, heavily medicated. Anyway, gradually, via great humiliations, a stint in a cave and a complete rupture with his father, these lungings and impetuosities resolve themselves into the properly achieved Franciscan humor, a kind of continual outrageous sanctity. And this is the sort of Francis of preaching to the birds and things like that and running around like a child. Francis becomes Francis and begins to attract followers. What he's doing is pretty straightforward. He's actually living by the words of Jesus. Love your neighbor, give it all away, praise God, and don't worry about tomorrow. And of course, take up your cross and follow me. Pretty straightforward and a head-on challenge to the world. It is no longer enough, for example, to give alms to the lepers and walk off feeling pious. Now, like Francis and his brothers, you have to accompany the lepers. And they lived with the lepers, to be honest. You have to stand with them in what Lepin, the biographer, calls the world of the excluded, of the lowest in society, which in the cosmic reversal affected by the Gospels turns out to be the highest place on earth. Chesterton, who wrote so beautifully about Francis, he tried to explain the saint's jangling polarities as the actions of a lover. If you think of how a lunatic lover acts sometimes in the name of love, Francis was a lover of God, and that is why he did all the crazy zigzag things that lovers do. But Parker concludes with this phenomenal paragraph. He says, right now we need St. Francis. Now that kindness is countercultural, we need his extremes of wild charity to pull us back toward it. And we need his asceticism, his self-denial, his merry disdain of health and comfort and security. which is a rebuke to our self-care. There are no safe spaces, no guarantees. The only stability is the bottomlessness of divine love, the trapdoor held open by grace. So we take the hand of Francis,
So
and-
good, Dave.
and down we go.
This is in the Atlantic.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Wow.
I know.
No.
Yeah, you guys see, God has a
That's
personal
crazy.
investment in my adult education series, and that's why these things happen. I
That's
have to.
right. Exactly.
It's the only logical explanation.
Exactly.
James Parker's always worth reading, and this is a worthy subject if ever there was one, right? I mean, there's something about this that just you read about Francis, and yeah, he does read like a lunatic, and the contemporary impulse to kind of sanitize him and make him sort of just cuddly and with all the
God, with
forest
the
animals.
birds.
You forget the fact that he had stigmata that he died from, and that he was an ascetic who was constantly fasting, and to be a Franciscan was to renounce everything. That's why he could see everything as a gift, by the way. All of nature, all of everything was just sort of God's blessing because he had nothing. He took it all off. But I found this to be profoundly inspiring. And part of what's the inspiration is just to actually see someone attempt to truly live like Jesus. Jesus is just that captivating. Of course, I spoke this to a room full of wonderful people who were captivated by the story, and yet all of us would never, out of probably fear for our own safety, embrace the kind of radical downward mobility and complete dependence on God that Francis did. Yet we're all attracted to it. It's so exciting and interesting and compelling, and there's something of the truth to that kind of holiness. But what do you guys think about this?
Okay, I have two things to say. The first is I do think we are very attracted to it. And I think we have moments in our lives where we are given the invitation to go through that trapdoor, which is such a beautiful way of putting it. Not forever, right? But to do something a little wild, to stand up for somebody. I always think about me getting into a bizarre fight with two gentlemen in a airport, for the sake of a young woman who they were being hurtful towards. I think we actually do have these like little trapdoor moments, and I totally think that's God flirting with us. Just like
the trapdoor held open by
hey,
grace.
remember, this is what's real, and this is really beautiful, and maybe you're not going to live here your whole life, but isn't this sustaining until the next time, right? Like there's something about that. The other thing I want to say is I'm a big St. Francis fan, and to the point that our son's middle name is Francis. And I remember learning more about him in seminary and while I was working at a psychiatric hospital. And being around patients, especially I was with the elderly patients, especially the elderly patients who talked in visions, who had really intimate experiences of God. And I remember thinking St. Francis could be here. Like what a perfect, as I'm carrying this baby, like what a perfect name for him. So,
wow.
yeah.
I didn't realize that Francesco was not really a common Italian name. It was because Francis's his mother was French, his father was Italian, and he'd just come back from making a bundle of money in France, and he was so excited that he named his kid Francesco, which is basically Frenchy.
French.
He's like, yeah. That's basically what he was named. I mean, now today we have Pope Francis, of course, the first one to take that name.
But we wouldn't have it probably without him being named Frenchy.
Frenchy.
I love it.
R.J. Heyman, Dutchy. What do you got to say?
Well, first, I do think, there are a lot of figures in the Bible who probably had mental health issues. Matt Stanford wrote this book, Grace for the Afflicted, where he's like, David is probably bipolar, and a lot of the prophets seem deeply depressed, and God works through it all. So it's not sort of stigmatized at all. It does make me wonder, Dave, what were his relationships with other people like?
Well, he had he's basically the patron saint of bad relationships with one's father. That's for sure.
Yeah.
he seemed to attract a lot of people to him, to be honest with you. And he went and for example, during the Crusades, he went and talked to one of the sultans of Egypt, and he just sort of got through and preached to the Muslims, and then was allowed to leave. So there was something about this guy
Something
that
about
was
him.
clearly very
Compelling.
very childlike. I think that's captured in the Russell Mooney's film. But
I mean, I guess what it makes me think of is yes, it's a beautiful image and a Christ-like image, and I think if you were married with children, it would not be sustainable. If you're actually responsible for other people, I mean, there's a reason that Jesus wasn't married. That Paul wasn't married, at least as far as we can tell. We know he wasn't married when he was ministering. Maybe he was previously, but I also think that being married and having children is like a nonstop exercise in faith, because there's just so many things that are completely beyond your control. And there's a lot of, and you learn about grace, you learn about forgiveness, you learn about repentance, keep children, marriage, keeps you on your knees, it keeps you kind of desperate. So I don't know. There's sort of two sides of the same coin a little bit. Like Francis's life is amazing. It's, I'm sure it wasn't, in some ways it probably was a little lonely. Probably also wasn't. He had a lot of friends. There's also something very attractive about just kind of leaving it all behind and just basically just going to do whatever the heck you want to do. So I don't know. I'm challenged by it. Let's put it that way. But I'm always like, I don't think my wife and kids would be,
I mean, I think there's a younger version of myself that saw this sort of monasticism and kind of felt it was legalistic or just very dangerous. And I mean, I think that in some ways, he represented, the more I read about it, he represented almost like a gracious response to some of the staleness of medieval Christianity, and sort of to say that God actually wants to provide everything for you. Like that's what he was really saying in that. Or maybe that's too charitable, but I think that's true. And when Francis does this, when he goes about this, he doesn't avoid suffering. In fact, the culmination of his life is the infliction of Christ's wounds from the cross. Like that's part of it. And this man who's sort of, Chesterton talks about him being a mirror of Christ, and that, of course, if he were to be a mirror of Christ, then he would, and that's more of a Catholic view here, but then he would have to mirror the sufferings of Christ, which were at the core of his, the revelation of God. So I found it to be a more heartening, I think, view. Also, there's just something really attractive about not only this. I mean, if you want to see it as a fulfillment of the law or somewhat a closer approximation, you could say, well, that's beautiful, but you could also see it as just a picture of faith. And like that's talk about not his moral intuitions not being guarded by fear. I mean, he saw himself as a penitent. He was not like thinking he deserved anything. He definitely saw himself as a chief of sinners. I think there is something just inherently beautiful, that glimpse, the trapdoor of grace that the little glimpse you get by studying this man. So I don't know. You're right, though, RJ. If I were to go and do this and just walk into the woods singing psalms with no clothes on, I think
we'd scoop you right up.
You'd scoop me right up. There'd be no more podcasts.
Get you some help. Yeah, I just want to. I think there's a real gap here for St. Francis statues for people's front yards, where it's just stigmata, like no birds, no deer, just hands and him dying stigmata. I think
with the water coming out of the hands.
That could be a good fundraiser for us, Dave.
Yeah. Bring it back.
Yeah. Yes. If you guys don't give to the podcast, we're going to start making stigmata St. Francis statues. That's a threat, dear listeners.
Yeah. Well, we have one more thing I want to talk about. The venerable Alan Jacobs. There's no writer these days that I think more highly of, the thoughtful Baylor professor who, yes, former Mockingbird Conference speaker. He's been writing for us, and he wrote this wonderful piece about Richard Wagner's opera Parsifal, but you don't need to know about Richard Wagner's Parsifal to know about what he's writing about. Jacobs wrote this for Mockingbird about Roger Scruton, the British philosopher's unpacking of it. So why talk about it on the Mockingcast? Well, the title is Spells and Prayers. He's interested in talking about the difference between spells and prayers. This is Scruton Scruton says, religion tells us that we do not have power over the world and that we must learn to accept our limitations and to recognize that our salvation depends on the God who will rescue us. When we pray, we do not command the world to obey us. On the contrary, we humbly acknowledge our lack of power and ask God to intervene on our behalf. In this respect, prayers are the opposite of spells. The one who casts a spell is assuming power over reality. He has no need of God since he is God. He is assuming the powers of the Creator and subduing life and matter to his will. Magic, in this sense, is a kind of blasphemy. And when alchemy was condemned by the medieval church, it was as an attempt to dispense with God. Jacobs now says this: I often tell my students that whether Christianity is true or not, it is the most unnatural religion in the world. Even a cursory study of the world's religion will show how obsessed humans are with finding some way to A, gain the favor of gods or transhuman powers of any kind, and or B, avert their wrath. Religious seeking is almost always about these two universal desires: to get help and to avert trouble. But in Christianity, it is God who comes to seek and save the lost. It is God who reckons with his own wrath, himself making propitiation for our sins, and not for ours only, but also for the sins of the whole world. The standard, or rather the obsessive practices of homo religiosus, or the religious man, have no place here. In Jesus Christ, the Christian gospel says, God has done it all. I say, Jacobs writes, this may be true or it may be false, but it is the Christian account of things, and it is very, very weird. So weird that it is easy, indeed natural, for us to fall back on the standard model of religion and turn our prayers into spells. How often do we think, perhaps in some unacknowledged place deep inside our minds and hearts, that when we come to church and say the appointed words and perform the correct actions, we are somehow getting management to take our side? I love his formulation: spells versus prayers. It was Francis. He was not a spellcaster. He was a man who fell back on prayer. And that's unnatural, despite talking about his embrace of the natural world and all this stuff. And I don't want to force too much of a thing here, but just to say that I find what he says is true about the natural religious impulse is to how can I control the world? I want to do the right things so that, fulfill the law, so that God will make my life easier or make me feel a certain way or give me kind of a certain amount of prosperity. And yet here you have the Christian gospel, which comes and says, actually, it is not about climbing some ladder to manipulate or leverage God into your own program, your own safety even. But it is the process by which God intervenes on your behalf when you don't deserve it, when you're least ready for it, even, but with love, not with more fear, but with love. Sermon over. Love to hear some closing words from you guys about what Alan says: spells and prayers.
I love this. I love it from the standpoint of sort of secular culture right now, where it's like people talk about speaking things into the universe, and there's so much magical thinking among women in America. It's really sort of terrifying to me.
Well, also men when it comes to sports.
I can't tell you how many. Sure. Yeah.
Don't jinx it.
But women, when it comes to like their everyday lives, or like, I mean, I have friends who will say like, oh, we shouldn't speak that into existence. And I'm just like, what the are you talking about? I mean, like, we don't have that kind of power. What do you mean? We're not witches. Like, so I think about that, but then I do think about the prayer life of my prayer life and the Christian prayer life of like praying for the way we want things to go, and how tenderly God must see that, with sort of a tender knowing that like that's not the way things go generally, but the way things go are the way that they were ordained to go. And how that can change your prayer life pretty dramatically. I mean, I think when you have a lot of shocking, sudden suffering or just a long season of suffering, I think you tend to pray less for the thing that you want or the ways that you want things to go, and instead just to pray for peace for what is, right? And the ability to accept it. The other thing it makes me think of, and I wish I could remember what episode it's from, but you know what? Just sit down and listen to every single episode in the new year, is Dan Van Voris, Christian History Almanac. It's
What up?
so good. It's a must listen every day. I was away from it for a while. I'm back to it now. But Dan, who's such a thoughtful theologian and so interesting at the same time, which is a hard thing to pull off, talked about, and I mean, this is a thing you've heard before, but the way he said it was just so striking to me that, you know, pre-Christianity, it was all about like offerings, you know, it was all about offering an animal or offering a child and now like in our world that is not Christian, it is still about offerings, right? It's like, what am I have to offer my time. I have to, you know, offer my discipline to exercise to get the body I want. I have to offer whatever. It's all about offerings. Like I have to read the right parenting book so that I can get the kid that I want, right? Which goes against all science, by the way. But like, I want to do these things to get this offering. And in Jesus Christ, the offering comes down to us. God offers God's self to us. And it's, you know, it's a chalice upside down on us, right? I mean, it's just, it's a whole different way of being in the world. So, yeah, I love this from St. Jacob's, St. Alan. This is good.
Thanks, Sarah. Chalice upside down. Wow.
That's really good. I had a conversation.
It's the Holy Spirit, so I have no idea. I've already yelled at my children 3 times today, and then shit like that comes out of my mouth. I'm like, that's not me. Okay, I did not come up with that. That's right.
It's like the Pope
right,
speaking
Reverend
from his chair. He's infallible. Sarah on the podcast. No, there was a. Yeah, there's a family that comes to church. Usually, not all the time, obviously, but like the mom comes with the 2 kids. Dad usually doesn't come because he was raised in a different religious tradition. He's just not interested. But they're from Los Angeles, or she's from Los Angeles. She's born and raised there, and so he came this past Sunday. And we were talking about it afterwards because our kids play soccer together. And he had a lot of questions. He's come like a couple times, you know, usually Easter, Christmas, things like that. Easter. But one thing he said, you know, Arj, the more I look into it, I just don't think I really believe in or like any kind of organized religion. And I said, yeah, but like Christianity is not a religion, you know? And he said, well, it's really, he said, it looks like one. I'm like, yeah. I was like, a lot of people have worked very hard for a long time to make it into a religion and to tell us that there are all these things that we have to do. But it's at the end of the day, it's not. It's a declaration of what God has done for us, apart from anything that we could ever do for him. So it is just, I really do believe that, right? That Christianity, it's the end of religion. It's not a religion. It's a proclamation. And when people begin to understand that, it does kind of start to change their lives. And yet the religious impulse is so deeply embedded in us that we do feel like we have to bring something. We have to get God on our side. And that article makes me think about my own prayer life and how much of the time do I approach prayer like a spell, you know? And I'm sure I do when I'm looking for a parking space, you know, when we're trying to make budget, you know, things like that. But I think what I also most often in prayer is like, okay, God, I pray that you would just push me where I'm supposed to go, open the doors I'm supposed to walk through, close the doors I'm not supposed to, go before me, be with me, clean up my messes, you know, please. Like, I'm just totally relying. I'm going to be living my life. I'm trying to do the best I can here, but I'm totally going to rely on you to do what you will, because you will anyway, right? But please use my life, our life, whatever it is, for your glory, your purposes in your way. And just give it to him, because he's, you know, he is God and I am not, thankfully. And he's a good God. He shows up and shows us what he's like, and he shows himself to be trustworthy and true, and we don't have to speculate because he showed us what he's like.
Well, that's certainly what Francis believed.
Yeah.
And they those days of plague and nonstop war,
Holy moly,
pretty egregious in different ways. That prayer, sort of throwing yourself on God's power, intervention, mercy, and love, is, I think, asking for God's will to be done. I mean, these are all these things that are inscribed in the scriptures in our prayer books, but you're right, they're not a religious scheme at their best, at least. They're actually similar to what that meditation guy said. It's always sort of like getting oneself to the place where your will and God's will are kind of aligned, and maybe that's the prayer this year,
which is just through failure and suffering.
I love that. I want to find that quote you mentioned. The day that all the yards are mowed, you'll know that Satan is in charge.
Somebody listening knows where it's from, so let us know. I'm sure.
This year, then, Sarah, let the yards go unmowed. I mean, because they won't be mowed anyway. But
don't clean up for the party.
Cilantro,
go to
rice.
BJ's.
Yes,
exactly.
Yeah.
Go to BJ's for your party needs, and because Party City is now closed, apparently.
That's so sad.
On that note, in the immortal words of Wayne and Garth, party on, you guys, in 2025. Can't wait to see what this year brings, at least for the three of us. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for listening, all of you out there, and we'll be back in a couple weeks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. Remember, you can find us on the web at www.mbird.com. And we'd always love to hear from you at info@mbird.com. Audio production for the Mockingcast is provided by TJ Hester. And if you like what you've heard, please drop over to iTunes and leave us a rating or review. Until next time.